There's much talk of this concept of bipolar disorder, and that this then also is not just a phenomenon or set of activity, problems, whatever, but a, quote, biological problem and a, quote, broken brain problem. But what if this so-called bipolar problem or disorder is actually what you might call a kitchen sink of problems, and that they all have one or more things in common also? Off the top of my head, and that no small thing perhaps in terms of having looked at the issue for some time, several things come to mind, such as the so-called bipolar having rapid speech, or periods of, quote, depression. One person having explained that quite well to me, I think, as being bummed out or hopeless. That this theoretically alters back and forth as though it were some kind of hormonal issue or something else going on internally in the chemicals and structure otherwise of the brain itself, and not the premises that one operates by, thinking-wise, cognitively speaking. And so it is sometimes called a mood disorder, I think. Some say sometimes a person is too elated, too excited, and otherwise too bummed out, too, quote, depressed. Well, it strikes me, having looked at life, that perhaps a, quote, elated approach to life is oftentimes simply in an individual who is not in a malaise, who is not just performing a function on the job as an assembly line worker, quite unhappy, but not severely, but actually oftentimes quite happy. What happens if these individuals who are quite happy then are called something of an anomaly? And yes, rapid speech can be problematic in some manner, and yet some races of people speak much more rapidly because their vocabulary requires it, if one were to look into this linguistically. Or also, life can be so complex and data required to be provided so quickly and in such great a manner of quantity that to do so slowly means you'll be passed by. In other words, everybody talks of the urban way of life as hurly-burly or rapid and such. If you drive down the highway at 30 miles an hour and everyone else wants to go 60, you might just get run over, so to speak. And so you go with the flow of the traffic. Isn't that then why some would say a lot of people these days are running around like chickens with their heads cut off? Who's to say then what is racing speech or racing cars versus not? Another commonplace topic in this so-called bipolar kitchen sink set of issues, I would say, is sexuality. Some would say that those who have bouts of, quote, manic episodes or bipolar issues from time to time are pursuing too much in the way of sex. And yet, who's to say that pursuing too little sex should not also be a disorder, or pursuing any sex a disorder also? Maybe all sex is a form of escape. Who gets to be the sex policeman and say what is too much, too little, or whether any sex at all is good or bad? In fact, is sex any different in a way than crack cocaine as per how much it is desired and how pleasurable it is, especially by males? Maybe the issue isn't so much one of too much, quote, sexuality, being called bipolar as an aspect of that topic, rather than we're talking about a sex addiction per se, just like any other addictive process then. Another factor talked of sometimes is that the so-called bipolar person at times or more spends way too much money. Or also that they think too highly themselves as per who they really are. But then doesn't that talk more about the issues of, quote, narcissism in this latter case? And as per spending, or spending too much money, first of all, who's to say how much is too much? And don't we spend money oftentimes for distractive purposes? Who's to say too much is this versus others saying that it is that? In other words, my grandmother, who raised me my first 4 years and every summer until I was 15 on her farm, had simple pleasures, you might call, compared to most. She never drove a car her entire life. She worked on the farm and left it twice a week, once for shopping and another time for church. Her favorite activity was a cup of coffee once or twice a day and 1 hour of television, a soap opera. And that in part to learn English. She was from Eastern Poland, a war refugee. So if she had upgraded and said, oh, I'd like to go get a cup of $4 worth of coffee in a cup per day, is that spending too much money and thus she has a problem called bipolar? Or if she wanted a car when she walked or got a ride from her husband or such, is that spending too much money to get a car and thus she has bipolar? Isn't too much spending thus in the eye of the beholder? In fact, it costs a lot more to raise children than to not raise children, and to be married typically than not married. So if a married person spends more, and a married person with children spends more, or anyone with children spends more than those not, do they have a spending problem? Are they overspending compared to some others and thus have bipolar? Isn't it all thus in the eye of the beholder, and what we call overspending, and indeed what the purpose of the spending is for? Is it to help others? Is it to get status? Is it for distraction? Is it for power? Is it for isolation? What is this money spent for? Now, I believe many of these issues I've brought up, they all fall under the rubric or umbrella of what is called the kitchen sink, as I call it, of bipolar disorder problems or defense mechanisms. For yes, indulgence in too much of such and such, whether, quote, overspending as some call it, or whether you call it indulging in too much sex or talking too rapidly, some would say, or also sometimes flipping on end into depression, some say, or being bummed out. Well, maybe these are just one type of a grouping of defense mechanisms, and the other types are not being addressed, alternatively, if you're not pursuing these. For instance, from my time in psychoanalysis and observation later and reading, I've concluded that there are some other defense mechanisms that are quite different and thus often don't require the use of these other ones. Some might call it, for instance, obsessive-compulsive disorder, amongst those not labeled a bipolar issue or factor or whatever. For instance, those who have what you call perfectionism issues associated with what they call obsessiveness or compulsiveness, OCD if you would. I think these are the least likely to have any desire for sex or spending of money. They're often, too, content to sit alone and not socialize and thus not spend money also in these manners, including often not getting married except to their computer or a job involving data. Another form of defense mechanism, I believe, that a person using the defenses, I think, if you wanted to call it that, often associated with what they call bipolar, or not a bipolar umbrella, I might call it, of defenses, is aggression held on to, or aggression being displaced upon certain people and not others. In other words, if you enjoy hanging on to anger, this can, quote, cover up and manage a lot of fear and anger in oneself. If so, why would you need a whole bunch of other defense mechanisms that I've talked of before that typically might fall under the rubric of bipolar disorder? That's a very aggressive person, or a person very desirous of seeing others suffer, often at one's own hands if one can make that happen, or a person very restricted in affect, emotion, and perfectionistic in manner, would be the least likely to be engaging in both of these elements here in all the other factors I talked of. In fact, you might state that there are two types of people, the quote empathetic and the non-empathetic, and I would state basically you would probably find the most non-empathetic people engaging the least in bipolar defense mechanisms. Isn't that why, if you went to a prison and looked at a mesomorphic-oriented murderer there, I dare say not one of these individuals, by and large, would have any factor that they struggled with or were using to cope with life called a bipolar issue. They might not have any so-called racing speech, issues with sexuality gone haywire, or above average, you might call it. They might have no issues with, quote, overspending of money, but they sure would have a lot of issues with aggression as a defense mechanism and the associated problem of loving to see others suffer, at their own hand if possible, as long as they are not, quote, spitting in the wind and applying that aggression against the people who are, quote, feeding them, whatever it is they desire to be fed with. Isn't that then possibly, I raise the question, why the so-called bipolar person is often said to be very bright, very creative? I dare say the opposite is probably sitting in prison as a mesomorphic person and called a brute, and yes, non-creative in most cases. The creative ones might be simply the people who are more likely to be empathetic and more intelligent sometimes also. Although the latter point I have to question sometimes, but at any rate. The more empathetic person is probably the least desirous to see others suffer, and that then strips them of this defense mechanism. What do they have left? Well, some would say overspending, over-sexuality, rapid speech to block painful thoughts and manipulate others' thinking also, and or, of course, block others from asking questions that might be painful to answer. So to recap very briefly, simply to say that we have problems galore these days with a number of people suffering from bipolar, I think in calling it then too a mood disorder, misses the point of how complex life can be and how a number of people are, in my mind, likely simply using a whole bunch of defense mechanisms falling under a big smorgasbord of things we can do to block fear, anger, and guilt. And a certain number of people doing this more than others, the other people turning much more to what you might call over-control, if you wanted to call that OCD or paranoia or what have you, and also a number of people very aggressive and oftentimes enjoying to do so at their own hands upon some others. And these two factors that I just explained at the end here then, often meaning that if you looked at such individuals, you would not see, in my mind, any trace hardly of all the other factors we call bipolar factors. One last point then, I do believe that quote-unquote bipolar medications or drugs, yes, drugs, do successfully often treat the issues that I've been talking about, whether overspending, rapid speech, Over-sexuality, if you wanted to call it, and more. But so does a number of other things. Some say, and I believe it likely to be the case, these are numbing agents. And yes, a numbing agent will cure everything under the sun, all fear, all anger, all guilt. So does sleep, for that matter. Sleep is an excellent numbing agent. Many climb into bed to escape to escape all these issues. In fact, isn't death the ultimate pill for anger, fear, and guilt? The ultimate bipolar medication, then you might say. Perhaps so many people are taking bipolar, quote, medications or numbing agents so that these defense mechanisms aren't so commonly needed to be used or found to be used, but at the price to be paid of being what you might call a zombie. And the more zombies there are, the more commonly accepted it is, and those not so and not aggressive called too exuberant, or shall we say, inappropriately perhaps, manic. And I might have said that was a final comment, but how about a final comment about a final comment? And that would be, I speculate that most all so-called bipolar diagnosed people are in urban areas. Isn't that why then sometimes New York City is called a city that has a lot of manic energy? Or isn't that too why some say urban areas are called rat races? Or that there are a number of people there running around like chickens with their heads cut off in what you might call racing speech, manner, and physical activity? Now looking back, I believe, who was it? Durkheim. Oh, there was a sociologist 100 years ago. He had spoken of how urban areas have a high degree of pathology, including a massively higher number of people per capita who commit suicide. Sam Vaknin, in a video he has put out on YouTube on narcissism, also had as part of that segment talk of how urbanization has caused many people much grief, and in turn driven perhaps by industrialization. This is not a foreign concept. Maybe thus the problem is that urbanization is too marketed as the ultimate in life. Or maybe urbanization has simply grown upon us in some other factors too. Rather than saying so many people have bipolar disorder these days, maybe we need to start saying way too many people have urbanization disorder, and that they are hanging around way too long in urban centers instead of going where life is saner, where family structures are more stable, and where thus a lot of these problems would melt away over a quick period of time perhaps. And you might call it then an instant cure almost, in a period of weeks or few months, without, quote, bipolar numbing drugs, called, quote, medication. But of course, most practitioners practice the prescribing of these drugs in urban areas, otherwise they could not pay off their student loans for one thing. And so round and round it goes. Maybe the so-called diagnosed bipolar person needs, along with a prescription for a certain medication, another prescription that says leave Urbania and go to the countryside where things are saner, calmer, more helpful, and the way things were always optimally meant to be. And that your biggest problem is not your brain, but where you live. Maybe the ultimate issue then is that we need to think more and more about our environment and not so much about our brains per se.